And we are going to be recording today. So welcome everybody to the first Deep Connections webinar. We're very excited. Today's will serve as kind of a backdrop for our project, and it's an overview of the DEE-Project and of DEEs. I'll start by giving a quick overview of our project and what our mission is and our partnerships that we have going on. And then Tracy Dixon-Salazar will lead us through an overview of DEEs. A few quick things. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box, and I'll take it away from here. So I think many of you who are joining us today have a very clear sense of what DEEs look like, even if we don't understand them as well as scientists like Tracy who know the ins and outs of it all. But you know, basically there is a lot of fear and isolation that comes from having a child with a DEE, developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. And really, it can be incredibly isolating. I know many of us are probably isolated from friends and family and communities due to the constant challenges that arise, right? I can speak from the experience of with my son Elliott, who is 7 and has SCN8A related epilepsy. So in addition to dealing with his neurological and seizure related issues, we also deal with GI issues, endocrine issues, hypotonia, CVI, urology, ENT, pulmonary, dental and oral issues, physical medicine and equipment issues, dealing with IEPs, working jobs and trying to maintain care, getting meds in the house, reordering those on time, the 15 plus meds that Elliott takes every day. And that's not even to start talking about having fun with our kids, right? So we know that this life is overwhelming, and there's so many challenges that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And they're distinct from a lot of other communities. So, you know, there are all these ways that each of us is dealing with our own kind of challenges with our own families and our own children. And there's a lot of ways that we overlap and we have things in common. And, you know, DEEs are a heterogeneous group of these rare and ultra rare epilepsies. And there's a wide range of these developmental issues that overlap. So, and even within our disease communities, we can be isolated. I know that within SCN8A, there's a very wide spectrum of how children present. Elliott tends to be on the more challenged side, while there are other kids who are, you know, walking and talking and performing at grade level. So we know that even within our own communities, it can be isolating. So, you know, through networking and our connections with friends who are dealing with similar issues, we saw the potential to build these very deep connections and share with each other the difficult spaces that we live in. And frankly, we work with such incredible people at these other patient advocacy groups that are within our community. And so we saw the opportunity to build this new community across genetic or other causes, to share our experiences, share our knowledge, share our resources. And really that's how Deep Connections was born. So at Deep Connections, our mission is really to try to fill that space, right? And enhance support and access to information and resources for families of children with severe DEEs. And doing that in collaboration with a wide range of partners. So our key initial activities are going to be offering webinars such as this on topics that are really relevant to our community. So, you know, we'll be continuing to have conversations with our partners and members of our community about what issues are most important for us to have future webinars about. And then, of course, those webinars that we do will be hosted on our online resource center and be paired with a comprehensive curation of materials and resources on issues that are relevant to that issue. So, for example, our next webinar is on IEPs in February. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but in addition to having the webinar, that is going to be broadcast, we will have a wide range of resources on that page where people can link out and get more information. So, of course, we would not be where we are today without our partners. As of January 2020, right now, these are our amazing partners that we're working in collaboration with. And, you know, building this kind of a space cannot happen without a lot of partnership. And we're looking really to build on the support that each of these organizations has created for their own communities and finding ways to share our resources with each other. We are, of course, hugely indebted to Tracy, who you'll be hearing from shortly, and her leadership as the coordinator of the Rare and Catastrophic Seizure Club, or the Really Crappy Seizure Club, as it's also known, a space that allowed us to launch this idea and has proven really to be a safe and welcoming collaborative space. So let's see, partnership is obviously key. This is us launching at AES in December, and you can see a lot of family and friends and partners were able to join us to really kick this off in style. For the partners who have already joined us, you've seen some of this, but for those of you who are on the line who have not yet partnered, or even frankly, individuals who are interested in somehow playing a role, you know, there's lots of ways to partner with us. You can share the webinars, the announcements, and our website in your communities, in your networks. You can nominate a representative of your organization to help guide the future development of this project, or possibly sit on a working group. You can share our materials, from your organization, or experts from your organization that have something that they can present to the wider DEE community about. So frankly, anyone can propose a future webinar and then lead development and execution of that. So just a quick overview of what we currently see our working groups looking as. This could morph as we continue to grow and develop, but first of all is developing the resource center with all of these materials will take time, really looking around and seeing what's out there, contacting organizations, and making sure that we have all of that information in one place on our resource center. Webinar planning, we want to really work in coordination with our communities, survey and see what is most important to them, and go from there. I think that the IEP one, which is happening in February, is hugely needed. And there are many people in the community who are looking for that kind of expertise that Monica has to share with us, and giving us access to more of those resources that she and her team have developed. We're looking at building this resource out so it's not simply a website, but that it becomes a space that people can come to connect with one another, to find ways to link with other families, chat, share stories, share challenges, and hopefully find answers with one another. Sustainability is, of course, going to be key. We want to make sure that this is a resource that is continuing to address the needs of our community and has the resources to do that. We're incredibly excited that we actually just got word that we have our first sponsorship from Xenon, who we're incredibly grateful for, and are looking forward to finding additional ways to make sure that this is a platform that continue to grow. And lastly, we see this as a space that could potentially hold a lot of value for looking at potential research around DEEs, given all of these overlaps, all of these ways that we struggle together. How can we learn from that and find answers? So our next webinar, as I alluded to, is on February 26th about IEPs for children with severe DEEs. It will be led by Monica Jones, as I mentioned, CEO of the Brain Recovery Project, Childhood Epilepsy Surgery Foundation. And later today, it's not quite up yet, so, but by around 4 p.m. today, you should be able to go to our website at deepconnections.net, click on upcoming webinars, and be able to register. So again, we're so grateful for having you here with us today. Please check us out. This is our website. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. Feel free to follow us, retweet us. Be in touch if you have a story that you want to tell. If you're an individual, you know, and you have ideas, we would love to hear them from you, what you're interested in. We, excuse me, if you have expertise that you want to share, we will be looking to have stories be an integral part of our, an integral part of our website. So for example, you know, we'll have pages on enrolling in hospice care, malnutrition and the decision to get a G-tube, building healthy sibling relationships, GI issues, all those kinds of things that come up in our communities. And we'll want to pair stories from our community and families on the website. So feel free to reach out about that and tell your story. So we will be in touch in the next day with a survey, and we hope that you will fill it out and share with us how you think we did, what we can do better. And I hope that we'll only continue to get better as time goes on. And so I am going to now pass it on to Tracy Dixon-Salazar. And she, excuse me, a little bit of a technical issue here. So Tracy is a neuroscientist, a geneticist, a patient advocate, and a parent. She is a consultant working as a director of research and strategy at the LGS Foundation. She has over 20 years of experience in nonprofit work and advocacy work. And she'll get into a little bit more about her personal experience in the rare space. And let me go ahead and pass it off to you, Tracy.
Great. I am unmuted. I know that. Let me share my screen and we shall get started. Hang on just a second. There we go.
Wait, let me finish this first. I'll be right there.
All right. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. Oh, apparently we're a few slides in already. The presentation started on its own. All right. So I can't see my chat box anymore. So if you can't hear me or something happens with the tech, just email me. I have my phone in front of me, so it'll light up. So I'm Tracy Dixon-Salazar. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me. I know most of you on the call, not all of you, but I'm very excited that I get to talk about the DEEs. I'm very excited about DEEP and the webinar series. There is a lot of work to be done, and we need each other to do it all. So I'm just so excited that this is moving forward. That's a picture of me on the screen there, hopefully that you can see. But more importantly, that is my DEE child who has LGS, Savannah, who I'm going to talk about. And this presentation is really designed for families living with the DEEs. I know we have some professionals on the call as well, but this really is to try to bring it home to them. So this has been our journey with the DEEs. If you look all the way over to the right there, this is my 26-year-old daughter, Savannah, who has LGS. But she, like all of our kids, have been on a long journey that goes back to her very typical birth and her development up until the age of 2 when she had her first seizure. Seizure came out of the blue. We had no family history whatsoever. We didn't know that she was seizing. We didn't even know what a seizure was. And initially, she was not diagnosed with anything. They were called episodes and spells, events, but not seizures. And she just had a few. And then when she turned 3, the seizures really came back with a vengeance. She started having seizures every day. She started having hundreds of seizures a day. She was eventually diagnosed with intractable epilepsy. They ultimately started to impact her development. And that was pretty much going to be, at age 3, when she turned 3, the first day of having seizures every day for the next 16 years of her life. She did not get the LGS diagnosis until the age of 5. And I'll be talking more about LGS for those of you that might not know what that is. And we now know that nobody's born with LGS. It's something that evolves over time. And over the next 16 years, she developed, her development was very delayed. And even though she aged, physically, mentally, she stayed at about that 3 or 4 level when she started first having seizures and not developing. And then when she was 18 years old, part of the work I was doing and others were doing in genetics and genomics and epilepsy, we found out that Savannah actually has a calcium channel disorder and put her on a medicine when she was 18 that remarkably improved her and our lives. And so today at 26, she does not seize every day anymore. She is developing again. She's up to a 5 to 7 year old level, depending on what you do. She can talk like crazy and drives us crazy. And also, is learning how to use a key in the door and put her seatbelt on and doesn't sleep 17 hours a day. But Savannah has 3 DEEs. She had intractable epilepsy, which is of childhood, pediatric onset with developmental delay. That's 1 DEE. She was diagnosed with a 2nd DEE at age 5, LGS, and then a 3rd DEE, which is this calcium channel overactivation disorder at 18. And so there's this overlap across the journey of all of these that I want to talk about. So what is an epileptic encephalopathy? And that term came first before the developmental was added. So I want to talk about this briefly. The actual official definition is it's a group of epilepsy syndromes where the frequent epileptic activity contributes to the cognitive and behavioral impairments beyond that would be expected just from having the syndrome alone. So the seizures themselves are starting to contribute to the developmental delay. That's what an epileptic encephalopathy is. A developmental and epileptic encephalopathy is something I'll talk about in just a minute. And in the spirit of, in the spirit of this concept of, being able to go further, faster, and not reinventing the wheel, most of my slides have actually been outright, borrowed, stolen. No, not stolen. They were given to me. And so I've tried to acknowledge who they're from. Ingrid Shefford, many of you know, is an expert in the DEE space and has been crucial in the naming of these. So you'll see my acknowledgments on the slides for these. So I have a kid with a DE. I work full time. Who's got time to make slides when they're already made? So here's a list of some of the epileptic encephalopathies: DOSA syndrome, Dravet, early myoclonic encephalopathy, Landau-Kleffner, LGS, of course, West. And then the gene-specific epilepsy syndromes of much, there are now more than 100 genes. And I can't, the list goes on and on and on here. Not all the syndromes or the genes are listed here. And a child can have more than one of these. So you can have, West syndrome infantile spasms that evolves into LGS, which is also caused by a gene deficiency disorder or something along those lines, as I'm going to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about this epileptic encephalopathy triad that's been described by Ann Berg and Ingrid Shefford pretty extensively over the last 5 to 10 years. You have to have seizures in order to have epileptic encephalopathy. I'm sorry, you don't have to have seizures. Let me state that again. You do not have to have seizures. Now, 95% or more of the kids do have seizures, but you don't have to have them. You do have to have abnormal EEG, which is also called epileptiform activity on EEG. And there is always an impact on development, but it's not always present. The seizures are not always present, and they're not always first. And that's where the developmental and epileptic encephalopathy term has really originated from. So with the seizures, there are typically seizures present in more than 95% of epileptic encephalopathy cases. Usually multiple seizure types: tonic-clonic, focal, myoclonic, atonic. There might be an explosive onset of the seizures, like myotonic atonic epilepsy, but it also might be gradual, like in Dravet syndrome, where the child usually has their first seizure associated with a change in temperature, whether it's heat from being put in a warm bath or a fever, something along those lines. Not always, but usually. And it could be more of a gradual onset. Sometimes there is only one seizure type. But the seizures are not essential. Not all kids with Landau-Kleffner will have seizures, but they have an epileptic encephalopathy. And the reason for that is because of the epileptiform activity. It's the abnormal EEG that's present, that's not manifesting and showing itself as seizures in the child. There will be frequent epileptiform discharges. They're not distinct seizures. They're just really abnormal. You could have slow spike and wave, which is characteristic and associated with LGS. can have hypsarrhythmia, which is associated with West syndrome. You can have multifocal discharges. These are just a few of the patterns that they can see. And they're occurring between seizures for the most part. The timing of when these occur, they're usually very frequent, but they don't always have to be, especially as the evolution is occurring. We don't really know how much abnormal epileptiform activity has to be present in order to be considered an encephalopathy. But we do know that when you start to see these abnormal patterns on EEG, that it's really not a good sign that things are going in the good direction that you want them to go. If you've never had epileptiform activity, then you do not have an epileptic encephalopathy or a developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. So that needs to be present. And then there's the impact on development. So for kids with EE, the development can be normal, like they were with my daughter Savannah, or it can be delayed from the beginning. The development could be delayed before the seizures even begin. There can be development and then the child can plateau for a while and then develop again and then plateau again. There can actually be regressions in some children. There could be development where there's one development, like my daughter, and she kind of stayed at a 3 or 4 year old level for 16 years until the seizures were brought more under control and she started to develop. Or there can be these stepwise. And then there are certainly triggers for the worsening of development: seizures, infection, brain swelling, you know, all of these things that we know. You know, Savannah would have a seizure, a cluster of seizures, and she'd lose speech for several days. So there's this, this changing in the developmental status. For all epileptic encephalopathies, they start with the seizures, and then you have the frequent epileptic form activity, which could just be present. You know, many kids don't come in with a seizure, most do, but when they hook them up to an EEG, they'll see these really abnormal EEG brain waves. And then the development or slowing, if it wasn't present already, will start to show up, and if it was present, will get even worse. So that is an epileptic encephalopathy. And we know from early research that they can be caused by a number of things. Scientists and doctors generally group them into two categories: structural, which means that there's some abnormality on the EEG, cortical dysplasia, a focus from where the seizures are coming from, a cyst, calcifications, abnormal wiring, brain areas missing, the brain is swollen, they're too big, it's too small. So there's a number of structural things that can be seen on the MRI. And in some cases, not a ton, but some very important cases, and more as time goes on, the child can undergo surgery and can actually have resolution of their seizures. So there are instances where the epileptic encephalopathy, the seizures, and the abnormal EEG activity can go away, and the child can go on to develop without the bombardment, and in many cases, you know, go on to live a full life. So there's precedence for that. That can happen. There's also the genetic causes. As I said, there's more than 100 genes, and we know there's precedent that in some cases that you can tailor meds around the genetic cause and tailor treatments. Dravet is a good example where if you stop certain medicines like carbamazepine and oxcarbazepine and start meds that tend to work better in Dravet, like topiramate or steripental or valproic acid, that, or fenfluramine, which is coming out, that you can actually really begin to improve cognition for these children. And that's what we want to do. And so the term epileptic encephalopathy now has really evolved and is continuing to evolve. We now have the developmental and or epileptic encephalopathies. So you can have a DEE. A few people have an EE. I'm not really sure about Savannah. You know, she did not have developmental delay until the abnormal EEGs. And so it'd be hard to say if she was going to develop slowly just because of her calcium channel disorder or not. But there are some kids that have just the EE. And then there's some that have the developmental EE, where it's impacting development beyond what would be expected by just the genetic mutation or just the brain injury alone. So you have developmental impairment with these, which can lead to the epileptic encephalopathy, which should be which impacts the AED selection, and you can hopefully try to help the child. There are now gene encephalopathies that are emerging, which I'll talk about. There's a wide range of comorbidities, as Gabby talked about. It's not just the seizures, although we do certainly focus quite a bit on those, and those are a problem. And the outcomes may be poor, even if you stop the seizures. There are a number of instances, especially like with KCNQ2 encephalopathy, where the seizures can stop, but the child still continues to be delayed and not develop properly. So this is a whole complex terminology that we as patients and family members need to start to understand, because the scientists are using it, but it is changing. And so we need to understand that it's not going to be this way forever. As new data and science comes in, we get smarter and better at understanding this, and new naming will happen. So here's kind of where we settle on the syndromes for now. Across the bottom, you have age here, where you've got, 0 to adult, and the developmental and epileptic encephalopathy span this whole age range. You can find adults that have it. Seizures start in childhood for the most part, but they do live and become adults. And initially, we had only described a few syndromes. LGS was one of the first, Dravet one of the second, and we now have a number of other syndromes that have been added, and even more are continuing to be added and will continue to be added. I'm going to talk about the genes in a minute. These are not listed up here right now, but I will get to those. But I want to just talk for a second about how the names of just these syndromes listed here, which are, a syndrome is a collection of symptoms. I'm going to just give you a tiny bit of background about why they're changing. When I first came into this space, I was like, why do they keep changing the names of everything? They're making me crazy, and I understand, as a scientist now, because I'm also a scientist, why they do that and why clinicians want the names to be changed. But we also need to understand that changing the name does create problems for the other groups. If a group of patients just stood up today and said, we're going to change the name of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome because we don't like it, there's a bigger implication for that. So in the science world and in the medical world, so we want to start communicating together. So I just want to give you a little bit of background, because I was pretty upset about this when I first came into the space, about all the name changing, and now I'm much more accepting of it. So I want to talk a little bit about, I guess I did finish the slide. So the DEEs sort of overlap all of these different syndromes here, and the ages also associate with those. So sorry about that. So the syndromes names and how they change over the times. So just want to focus just on one syndrome, but what I'm going to say about LGS, which has been around the longest and I obviously know the most about, is this is true for all of the syndromes. So I want to just talk about this for a second. So the name Lennox-Gastaut, it wasn't even really brought about by Lennox and Gastaut themselves. It really came from naming the papers that they wrote early on. The first EEG findings of LGS has a very specific slow spike in wave pattern on EEG, was first published by Gibbs in 1939. And then in 1950, that was correlated with the seizure types and the intellectual disability, that EEG pattern. And that was a paper by Lennox and Davis back in the 50s. 15 years later, Charlotte Gervais wrote a publication where she described Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And then in 66, Gastaut published a paper of 100 cases of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, but just called it Lennox syndrome in the paper. It wasn't until 3 years later in 69 when Niedermeyer named it Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, or LGS. And so you can see across this 30-year period, it evolved over time just in the naming. And it was really based on the published papers. And so I did a postdoc with a guy named Vincent Cantegrel, and he described a syndrome probably in about 2013, an intellectual disability syndrome. And it's today called intellectual disability of Cantegrel type, because he was the author on the paper and they just needed a way to describe it. Lennox-Gastaut syndrome today is defined by these 3 boxes here. You've got multiple types of seizures, so always more than one type of seizure in LGS. You have the abnormal EEG, so the slow spike in wave. There's also something called generalized paroxysmal fast activity, or PFA, which occurs mainly during non-REM sleep, and then intellectual disability. We know that you don't have to have intellectual disability from the beginning of LGS, but it's present in nearly everybody by the time they've had the diagnosis for 5 years. So we go by the ILAE, which is the International League Against Epilepsy criteria: tonic seizures during sleep, slow spike in wave, this paroxysmal fast activity, an abnormal EEG, and then more than one type of seizure. And so here's the EEG here. So this is the definition we use today for LGS, but it's still debated, and it really depends on which doctor you have and where you live, and I'll tell you why. One is, these are all the causes or etiologies of LGS. It can be caused by brain malformations, vascular abnormalities, infections, a number of genes, including tubular sclerosis, and each of the genes listed over here. This list is not exhaustive. Tumors, traumatic brain injury, metabolic diseases, and then other syndromes. We think we know the cause in most cases, but if you ask patients with LGS, about 70% do not know the cause of their LGS. So while doctors think we know the cause in most cases, they're not relaying that to patients. And so often in LGS or even in any of these, you might be just told you have tuberous sclerosis, but never told you also have LGS. But if you have that EEG, that we talked about and the other features, you also have that. And in the naming of the new gene syndrome, so you may have CDKL5 deficiency disorder, but you may also have LGS, and you can have more than one. And I'm personally of the mindset that you should be in whatever communities benefit you. So if you can get help or access to meds with the LGS diagnosis, great. If you could do it with the CDKL5 or any of these genes or any of these other features, you should do it. So as patients. But it is confusing because the definition of LGS has changed over time. And here's just a span between 1950 and 2004. Here's the features at the top: childhood onset, intellectual and developmental disability, more than one type of seizure, tonic seizures and sleep, slow spike and wave, and then fast rhythms. And you can see some of the definitions required those things with the checkbox, and some did not. And so the ILAE requires all of those, but this doesn't happen in the clinic. Very often you'll get somebody who's LGS-like or has 3 of these 6 symptoms and matches the definition from 97. So it's changing. I don't think you need to know the specifics of it, but it is changing over time. And that's true for all of the syndromes, not just LGS. As we get more knowledge, as we study more patients and families, as we learn more, these things evolve. So it's good to just remember that as you're going. And I want to bring in now the genes, because all we've talked about so far is the syndromes. And this might be a little overwhelming because guess what? Surprise, they overlap too. Many genes are predisposition genes for LGS or for West. Dravet, primarily the SCN1A gene, but not always, not completely, not every case. So, and the same is true for all of these syndromes, which again are just a collection of symptoms. So, and it's really good to have syndrome information, because we do know that grouping patients by their symptoms can help us develop therapies for their symptoms, which is a good step. It's not a cure, but I would like the seizures to go away. I would like, to not be in the hospital all the time. I would like help with my kid getting to sleep. So some of these things are very important. So that helps us. So let's talk really quickly about the genes and their relationship to the syndromes. The gene revolution did not really start until 1995 in the epilepsies. And the reason for that had a lot to do with technology. Technology was not at a place where it is today to find genes and sequence a large number of people. So in the early gene era, work really done by Ingrid Scheffer and Sam Berkovic out of Australia in very large families. Not just them, but they have been a major player in finding many genes and confirming many genes. They really studied these really huge families where every person with a colored box or circle in this family has some form of epilepsy, and finding genes. So the first gene was found in 95. And then that led to more genes being found. In 2000, SCN1A, which is the Dravet gene, was found. 2005 was CDKL5, just to name a few. And then by and large, we hit a period where we didn't find a lot of genes with this method of looking at families, but we did find microdeletions. So these are copy number variants, the changes in the number of genes, so regions of the genome where we have too much of a certain genetic period or too little. And we now have many more of these microdeletions that have been identified that cause epilepsy, but here were the first 3 that were identified in this period. And then there was an explosion in about 2010 when the technology for sequencing all 20,000 genes, or approximately all 20,000 genes in a person, became commercially available. And that just exploded the gene discovery in epilepsy. And you can see the genes that were discovered here in this next generation sequencing era. And we now have the capability, and this is commercially available to families too, doctors can order it, to sequence mom, dad, and child where there's no family history. You know, we used to have to rely on the families, but we can resequence mom, dad, and child in LGS, but including all of the DEEs, and we're finding many, many genes. We do gene panels, we can do whole exome sequencing, and we can even do genome sequencing. So whereas the map looks like this is what it looks like for the syndromes, but if you try to overlay the genes on this, you get something that looks like this. So it's a little overwhelming. This is a paper that came out 2016. Here's the LennoxGaston syndrome, and here's a number of genes that are associated with LGS. But here's infantile spasms. We know that 30 to 50% of babies that have infantile spasms will evolve into LGS. And if you can see, here's one gene with LGS, but that gene also predisposes to infantile spasms. And then you have over here early onset epileptic encephalopathy, another number of genes, which then can also be associated with other features of LGS. So, and not just LGS, but any these other syndromes, there's a lot of overlap. And we're really just beginning to understand how the genes relate. So I think the take home for this is, you know, that you and your loved one, you know, fit into many communities, and it's an evolving field, and there are people like, you know, Dr. Sheffer and Dr. McTagg and many, many others, Dr. Nupp, that are figuring this out and will help us to understand it. But it is evolving, and hopefully you just have a general sense of this. But why does this naming craziness even matter? Like, why do we care? It all comes back to that evolution, like the evolution of my child, the evolution of your child. If you look over here at LGS, you know, by the time you have LGS, which is about mostly diagnosed between 3 and 5 years old, you have more than one type of seizure, you have an abnormal EEG, and you have cognitive impairment is either mostly there, but is emerging if it hasn't. Doesn't really matter, though, what your cause of your LGS is. The outcome is horrible. Most of them continue to have seizures into adulthood if they live. And most of them have cognitive impairment. But what if you could intervene before? Before there was LGS, there was treatment-resistant epilepsy, and maybe there was West syndrome or an EIEE, an early infantile epileptic encephalopathy. And that could have been treated before the evolution to LGS. And before treatment-resistant epilepsy, there was epilepsy, right? And so if we treat with the right drug, maybe we can keep kids and babies from going into resistant epilepsy. Before epilepsy was the first seizure, right? And maybe we can intervene after the first seizure if we know what's going on. And we know that other seizure types emerge along the way. We know delays emerge the way, but each of these lines represents an intervention point that we haven't been thinking about in this evolution. And then there's the causes. The etiologies are often present very early on, you know, either at birth or a little bit after. And so we can intervene on the genetic side. We can intervene on the infection side or the malformation side with surgery or with whole brain cooling for birth injuries. So we could target the etiology before it gets this bad. Because we know that the evolution leads to more and more changes in the brain development. You know, now the brain's developing, but now it's got all these seizures bombarding it, and so it's developing poorly. And so LGS, by the time you have this abnormal EEG, something has gone horribly wrong in brain development, and we really want to prevent it. And that's why all this naming matters. So if you have LGS today, you already have it. There's still hope. There are kids who get their seizures under control and can go on to live their best possible life. But we don't want to wait till you get there. And this is not just true for LGS, this is true for West, EIEs, and the other syndromes, targeting the cause and getting there. I'm almost done. I just want to cover a couple more slides. It also is important because of the treatment. So again, I'm focusing on LGS, but this is true for all of the syndromes. You know, get this diagnosis of a syndrome because that's what we see in the clinic. You know, gene testing is relatively new. Not everybody gets a gene early on. We have many LGS patients who don't know the cause of their LGS. It's not structural. It's probably genetic, but we still don't know. And then they go in, the doctor says, okay, well, we're either going to put you on medicine or we're going to send you for a surgical evaluation. And this is true if you have any DEE, really. Whether you have a gene, you don't have a gene, these are kind of the treatment options that are out there. So if you're a surgery candidate, you might be a candidate for resective surgery. You could become seizure-free, or the seizures can continue. And there's a lot of information that the Brain Recovery Project can tell you, more than I can tell you, about these surgeries and when they're beneficial. There's also palliative surgery. So this is surgery that's probably not going to stop the seizures, but it can be really helpful. And there's two major ones. There's if the seizures are occurring while the person is ambulatory or is walking and they're falling a lot, you get a complete corpus callosotomy. And then there's also the VNS surgery, usually when they're having prolonged seizures, or they're not having major drop seizures, or they are, and they want to try the vagus nerve stimulator. And if seizures continue after surgery, or if you're not a candidate, you go to adjunctive medicine. And we all know this loop. The seizures are refractory, you try a medicine. If that doesn't work, they're still refractory, you try a medicine. You know, my daughter tried and failed 26 different things before we found something that worked for her. You can certainly enroll in clinical trials for the symptoms, but it would be so much more exciting to enroll in a clinical trial for the cause of the epilepsy before you get to the diagnosis of a bunch of horrible symptoms. So that's really where we hope we're headed with this. You know, there are certainly a bunch of medicines in LGS and in some of the others that are preferred. But the reality is that of the many, many medicines and many more that are coming out, we are not making a huge dent. You know, we just had Epidiolex approved in LGS and in Dravet, and 6% of patients were seizure-free at the 2-year mark in the trial for the LGS patients. So I'm super happy for that 6%. Hoorah, I'm good with that. Thank you, Epidiolex, but we still have work to do. So. And we really do want to get to this point where right now we just group all our kids together and we treat them all for the most part with you know, a host of medicines that we don't really know if they're going to work with them based on their biology. We want to understand their biology. We want to separate them out. These are the ones with this gene. These are the ones with this injury. And then find the right medicine for them. And the field is moving that way. But we don't want to abandon the patients over here who don't have an answer yet. Maybe they don't have a gene, or maybe they don't know the cause, or maybe there's no targeted medicine. So we still need to keep making therapies to help them. And then all of us know, just here in my final 3 slides, that the LGS and the DEs are way more than just counting seizures. And we did a survey in our population for LGS. Dravet has done one, tuberous sclerosis has done one, and many of you maybe have done one as well in your community. And we're working to publish ours. Dravet's already published theirs. But there's so many issues. Sure, they're having tons of seizures, and that's a problem. Sorry about that. But there's sleep disturbances, face injuries, the developmental delay, the behavioral issues, the ambulatory issues. They can't read or write. They can't speak. There's hospitalized. They're having tube feeding issues. And I don't even have like constipation on here, you know, motility issues, endocrine issues. And then we asked our parents to prioritize, and each community is a little different here. But you know, these are all things as DEEs that we can work together on. Seizures and safety, we all care about that. You know, if the seizures aren't a problem in your community or in your child, you know, then it's the other. It's communication is a major issue. Behaviors, especially aggression, mobility and physical care issues, sleep, money, social isolation. And so coming together as the DEEs, in all honesty, a lot of these things that help LGS help all of the DEEs. And so we really can come together not just around medicines, but also around all of these other issues in terms of support and life hacks. Like, how do you deal with the aggressions? Because science hasn't figured that out yet, and it's going to be a while. And so finally, I just want to end with this slide. I love this slide. If you've heard me talk, you've seen it before. It's a group of dogs around a conference room table, and it says, meanwhile, at today's Feline Engagement Committee meeting, decisions were made on how to increase feline recruitment. And I love it because in the past, we have had a lot of dogs sitting around the table making decisions about cats. And what we need is everyone around the table. You know, we don't need a bunch of physicians around the table deciding for patients, and we don't need a bunch of patients around the table deciding for science. What we need are scientists at the table, and patients at the table, and clinicians at the table, and families at the table, making decisions and moving things forward in the understanding, and all helping each other and working together. So I'm so happy to see the distribution on this call. We don't just have patients and families on. We have some researchers, doctors, we have some clinicians, we've got advocacy group members, and so it's really exciting to see the dynamic of this old boardroom table of just one, just scientists talking to themselves or just doctors talking to themselves, while we're now talking to each other. We really can't all work together. We need to fiercely, divide at times and focus on the biology of our unique DEEs. But there are times where having a syndrome and a group of symptoms can really help us, and we unite around that. There are times where we unite around DEE, the name itself, and we can move the field forward faster. And so I'm excited about the future of coming together when we can to move further faster, and then moving things forward on our own DEEs for our own kids as that happens. So with that, I will just say thank you. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast or create too many issues. I'm going to pull back my screen back up, and now it's time for Jayetta to come back. We will take questions. I think I kept on time pretty well according to my screen, so hopefully.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Well done. Well, we're ready to take any questions. I have a couple that came in quietly along the way. So, Tracy, how can families learn about additional diagnoses that they may have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm trying to figure out what the best resources are right now for that. The resources that we use is, so certainly there's a website. It's not perfect, but it's called epilepsydiagnosis.com. I believe that's what it is. Let me double check that. Or if Gabby, if you or Jada want to check that while I'm afraid to move my screen. It's put out by the International League Against Epilepsy, and they mention all of the distinct syndromes. And so it's really a site mostly for doctors, but there are some videos and you can read about the syndromes there. The site's a little challenging for me to navigate because you have to go into, to pediatric, and then you have to go into syndromes, and then you have to find LGS. But it's a great. The information is great. And a place to start. I want one of those for patients and families. The Epilepsy Foundation is building out their website, so epilepsy.com is certainly a place to start. When my child was first diagnosed, there was a book called Seizures and Epilepsy in Childhood by John Freeman. It was volume 2 or edition 2 or something. And you could read briefly about the syndromes. And I just remember thinking, going back, and I'm like, she sounds like LGS, but no, what could it be? What could it be? So follow those instincts. And unfortunately, you have to do a lot of the research yourself, but talk to your doctor too about the diagnosis. As everyone should have, if you have a syndrome, you should know that. But if you have a gene or an etiology like lack of oxygen at birth, also called hypoxic ischemia, you should know that, because it's important in the treatment, it's important in the support of the community that you get. So do your research. I'm happy to help anybody navigate that. So just you guys can have my email. It's right there on the screen if you can see it. It's Tracy@lgsfoundation.org. I think you took my screen away, but Tracy@lgsfoundation.org, and point you to some resources depending on where you're at in the journey, because that question changes. And I've been working with some people on a journey website, like this journey that we all go through, and the information you need at certain times. So like my daughter, when she was diagnosed, they're like, brain surgery was really big back then, and they just found out it could be curative. I'm like, she needs to get brain surgery. Well, we fretted about brain surgery for 3 years, and she just was not a candidate. And it would have been nice to have not been worrying about that for 3 years when it really just wasn't relevant to her. So hope that helps resource-wise. Hopefully the DEEP website will, help with that as well.
Yeah, and it's epilepsydiagnosis.org.
Thank you. Yeah, there we go.
And Sydney just wrote in, my son wasn't diagnosed until 13 with LGS. No genetic markers found yet, no structural abnormalities, but he has all the must-haves list issues. I don't know if you have a response to that.
Yeah, so more and more we're finding that there are these rare cases of sort of teen onset, later onset LGS. So they maybe had EEGs in the past that didn't have the slow spike and wave, but then it's emerging when they're in their teens. We don't know a lot about this population, but it's not unheard of. But the slow spike and wave is emerging later. There's also instances where the slow spike and wave wasn't captured early on. My daughter's first 8 EEGs were all normal, So 8 normal EEGs, and then she had abnormal EEG. So in the beginning, during the evolution, the slow spiking wave is not always present all the time. And then it also changes over time. About half of the adults lose the slow spiking wave. And so in that case, I would say, you're very welcome in the LGS community. We don't have seizure control, but we have a great community. And we have projects and programs where we're trying to make sure families get reanalyzed every 2 years for genetic analysis. If they've had a gene panel, they should get an exome. They should go back and request their records if they haven't, just to make sure somebody didn't write something down. I mean, I don't know how much I've learned so much from just reading my kid's medical record that was never told to me by physicians. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, wow. I think we have time for one more question. What kind of research is potentially helpful with this community of DEEs together to promote research? Exactly, on comorbidities in particular, I think was the question.
Right. So there's a lot of research we could be promoting together, and the questions would all be very similar. And there is some of this research going on at Lurie Children's with Ann Berg. There's other research going on with Ingrid Sheffer, but definitely looking at the comorbidities and how they're different and the same. So like between Dravet, I know these two the best. I don't mean to speak about them, but between like Dravet and LGS, the REN survey was really interesting. This was the Rare Epilepsy Network. They did a big survey of a bunch of different rares. And when you said, how many seizures has your kid had in the last 6 months, when they grouped that data across 6 months, Dravet kids were having hundreds, so 10. LGS kids were having thousands. So I think that suggests that the seizure burden in LGS is, actually in both of them, it's horrible. But I think crisis mode and injuries and things in the LGS community rose to the top of this is a major concern, prioritize it this way. Whereas in Dravet, that was a concern, but they were more concerned, like my kid can't communicate, the status in the rescue meds, when they do go into them, they're not stopping. So it allows us to tweak our communities a little bit around when we're trying to go in and help our community around what is a big issue. It's like in my LGS community, it's like I could talk to them about like IEPs, which is important. I need to do that. But they're like, oh my God, if my kid's in the hospital every, 2 weeks for status, like what are we even doing at school? So that's one type of research. A lot of the questions are the same. So you could just kind of, tweak them here. We're collecting the data for KCNQ2. We're collecting the data for LGS. We're collecting the data for SCN8A, for others, and then compare them to each other. We can promote that. We can promote quality of life research. By and large, we're all using the same wheelchairs, the same helmets, the same rescue meds, the same seizure meds, the same sleep meds, the same, tube feeding stuff. And so we can promote research around what's best. And then certainly we could all be promoting find the right medicine in the right patient at the right time and treat early message, no matter what our particular gene or etiology is.
Right. And Isa reminds us that sometimes a karyotype is in order as well.
Yes. Thank you, Isa. You're absolutely right.
We have another question in from Maria, but I'm going to ask if maybe it's specifically to you. I think maybe Tracy, if you could take that offline, Maria will make sure that Tracy can reach out to you about that, because we're low on time and we want to make sure we finish up and respect time and keep to it. So with that, I will send a huge thank you to you, Tracy, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, advocating for our children and our families, for reminding us that it does go well beyond the seizure, and acknowledging that that's what a lot of us deal with, as you have for many, many years. And frankly, for improving the alignment between patients and researchers and institutions. And we thank you for that leadership. I just want to acknowledge also all of our partners who are on the line. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, we couldn't do this without you, and we're so grateful to have you along for the ride and helping us develop this. If you have not yet joined as a partner, feel free to do so. And if you're an individual, you may join us as well and add in your expertise or thoughts or experiences. We welcome all of those here. We have the working groups, as you saw, which if you're interested, please feel free to reach out about getting involved and let us know what's of the most interest to you. I think we'll be